Bannerlord's factions aren't fantasy. They're reflections of real warriors, real kingdoms, and real cultures pulled straight out of history. In this video, I'm going to be diving into the northern and eastern factions of Calradia and uncovering the real groups that inspired them. This is part 2 of a 2-part series, so if you'd like to see the western and southern factions, check the video link in the description or check out my channel for part 1. Okay, so we're going to start with Sturgia, which is a pretty obvious representation of the Kievan Rus, which was a Eastern European state that existed from about the 9th century to the mid-13th century, and it was created when the Varangians, who were Norse adventurers, travelled down from Scandinavia into Eastern Europe and would mix with the Eastern European Slavic population and rule over many of the cities there, creating the Kievan Rus state. So you might notice in Bannerlord that a lot of the nobles, their names sound quite similar in kind of the way they're built as the Nord noble names, and that is a reflection of how it was Norse adventurers that were kind of the establishers of the Kievan Rus state. So it was quite a culturally mixed state, and the political structure of Sturgia does represent this, as Ragnavad is kind of said that he is trying to get more power as prince, as it was pretty much considered a ceremonial title, but he's trying to make it into more of a de facto ruler style. That does represent the Kievan Rus model, that there were different cities that were ruled by different branches of the same dynasty. They were competing for influence, but they would work together. And due to the natural warring states between the cities of the Kievan Rus, leaders would need to be very heavy-handed. And this is quite well represented through Ragnavad, who seems to be focused always more on punishment than rewards. As Grand Prince, he does need to assert himself properly, because the other various clans aren't that really too bothered about the role of Grand Prince, as it is more ceremonial. So I like that Ragnavad feels slightly more precarious in his position. There's also a really strong military connection between Sturgia and the Kievan Rus, mostly because Sturgia does rely very heavily on their infantry with axes, obviously the big shields and the mail. It's very Norse, but once you do mix in their cavalry units, considering you got to consider the Druziniks, which are basically just the Druzina of the Rus. That's kind of the retinue of elite warriors that were very iconic to the Kievan Rus. And the Rus were very multicultural in their armor styles, as they did take a lot of inspiration from steppe tribes, Scandinavia. They had to deal with forest and river tactics. So the focus with Sturgia is definitely on a hybrid system. Now, if you've watched some of my videos, you know my opinion on Sturgia. I think they're a little bit too generalist and a little bit bland. I think they need to shine in maybe one specific area a little bit more, because it is kind of the empire that takes that jack of all trades route, and I think Sturgia is trying to do that, but then don't do it as very well. But that's a discussion for another video. The shock infantry with the heavy, you're looking at the heroic line breakers. That's very much of the Varangian style, but the Druzniks are the most obvious link to a unit they've pulled straight from the Kievan Rus. It is important to note, however, that Tailworlds had made Sturgia far more Norse-inspired alongside the Kievan Rus, because originally when Bannerlord came out there were no Nords, so they had to put much more of a Norse influence into Sturgia for players that wanted that Viking experience. Now obviously with the Nords being added, that Viking-ness, we'll cover that later in the video, but that's kind of been addressed. So now I think Sturgia can lean much more heavily into the Slavic inspirations that come from the Kievan Rus. Tailworld has made a lot of changes to Sturgian armor. I've noticed that with a lot of the units. But I do think as well that geographically, Sturgia is in a bit of a strange location, because I think they should be slightly more eastwards. And if you're looking at where the Kievan Rus sit, it's much more eastwards, whereas Sturgia for some reason sits as a mini Scandinavia before the actual Scandinavia representation above it, which puts it in a very strange position on the map, means it gets attacked on a lot of fronts. Not really the perfect way of representing, but I mean, I don't know if there's much that Tale Worlds can do about that, because everybody's become pretty accustomed to where Sturgia is, and any sort of huge change like that, like removing their western side and moving more cities to the east, that's probably a little bit too much. So, you know, it's decent enough that it is more north and easterly, but not quite as much as the Kievan Rus were when positioned within Europe. So now we're going to move on to the Khuzait, who have what some of the most culturally diverse inspirations in the game. Because at a first glance, you'd probably think, oh, the Khuzaits are just the Mongols and the Mongol Empire specifically under Genghis Khan. But I think it's important not to just limit them to that label, because they do take a lot of inspiration from other steppe nomad groups. You're thinking like the Gok Turks, the Kipchaks, and other steppe nomad groups that were also organized, but they were more regional powers rather than the global power of the Mongol Empire. Now, naturally, you're going to be looking at horse archers, and that's just kind of because horse archers were the main force of the steppe peoples, and that's well represented within Bannerlord. Obviously, the Khuzaits have the largest variety of horse archers, and they do have the Khan's Guard, you know, the best horse archers, which is, again, a good reflection. The army's definitely built around mobility, focusing on crossing, you know, again, you could cross huge steppe distances like the Mongol Empire did. And these groups definitely as well were quite varied in their traditions. As they crossed lands, they would inherit new traditions. And this is, you know, it's represented within the Khuzaits just because they do still have nomadic. When you go to like their villages, they look very nomadic. But when you go to their towns, it feels like more of like a Silk Road kind of vibe with the more brick buildings, and that just kind of represents maybe the difference in culture within the Khuzaits, as they do cover, you know, they cover quite a large amount of land on the map, but not, you know, not anywhere near the level of the Mongol Empire. When you look at the armor and weapons, it makes the blend with these steppe cultures very clear. You have the composite bows, you have fur-lined helmets, the lamella armor that's very Turkic in nature, and it's just, you know, they've clearly tried to emulate as much of the traditions and force of the steppe nomads when creating the Khuzaits. And then you also have the geography that does do a pretty decent job at reinforcing the connection. The Khuzaits occupy the eastern plains, obviously because the steppe peoples would come from the east when, if you're considering Calradia to be kind of European. And that's, you know, that's well represented. They come from steppe terrain, which, you know, very flat, and that's, again, they got the mountains, but, you know, is most of the maps around there are steppe, which is perfect for horse archers, and why the Mongols and other groups were able to dominate those areas so easily. The cities, again, they play, you know, next to the sea. I'm not really sure what the sea next to the Khuzait lands is really meant to be. Maybe it's kind of the Caspian Sea or the Black Sea is probably my guess. And it just represents kind of that trading hub area. And I think the important thing to know about the Khuzaits is that they reflect the diversity of the steppe world, as they do have their, you know, their minor faction representing an alternative viewpoint to the kind of Khanate approach. And so you've got, you know, a lot of groups when you're considering the Khuzaits. But, I mean, I think I'd say, you know, the Khuzaits as well, maybe they could be a little bit better in sieges, because the Mongols did do a lot of sieges. I don't know, but when you have a force that's so heavily focused around horse archers, maybe that's just fine for balancing. I mean, it'd be super cool to see custom siege technology depending on which faction you're doing. That would be really cool. Don't know if that would ever happen, but something like that could be really cool in the future. Another point as well that's good to make about Khuzaits following war sales is that obviously the steppe peoples didn't really focus on going on the sea very much, as they were much more focused on riding across land. And I do feel like in war sales the Khuzaits aren't very good on the water. If you watched my ship ranking video, you know I tend to rank their ships a little bit lower. And as well, based on their position on the map, they only have really one sea, so their only way of accessing water is through rivers. And I quite like that detail is kind of reflected. I don't know if that was intentional, but I feel like, again, with the Khuzait, you know, I put them S tier in my faction rankings. That's just because of how dominant they are on the land, not so much on the sea. So when you're comparing to other factions that are inspired by groups that historically run the sea much more, you kind of can piece together how the Khuzaits are designed to operate. If you are enjoying this Bannerlord Historical Inspirations video, please consider liking and subscribing to support the channel and for future Bannerlord content. The vast majority of you are not subscribed, so if you could subscribe it would really help me out. And you should especially subscribe because we just hit 2,000 subscribers, so thank you to everyone who subscribed. The growth on the channel has been absolutely amazing recently. Also, if you'd like to discuss anything I talk about in this video, or you'd like to help out with future videos, please consider joining the Discord server. The link will be in the description as always. Now we move on to the Nords, which are definitely the most simple faction to decode. They are just 100% Viking. I mean, you're looking at the Vikings of maybe the 8th to the 11th centuries. And it's just, I think that Tailwolds just wanted to create a purist Viking faction, because lots of people love to play as Vikings. They're just a super interesting group from history. They have that raider culture, which is really fun, and they tied in perfectly with the naval update. I mean, there's not really too much to decode with the Vikings and how they link to the Nords, because it's kind of obvious. I mean, you have, even starting with just their names, extremely Norse-style names. The military connection is focused most around infantry, and again that focus on large shields with round shields and shield wall combat. The elite units of the Nords just make them unmistakable. For the Vikings, you have the Huskarls, which were indeed long-handled axe bearers that were protected by mail and famous across Europe for being the elite guards of their jarls. You also have the long mail shirts, conical helmets, as well as the fur cloaks that just give off the complete Viking aesthetic. And you also have the throwing axes as well. You know, they do use javelins as well, but the focus on throwing axes is just to tie them in with the Vikings even more. And you also want to focus on the fact that the Nords are just basically entirely engineered around the sea. They obviously have that debuff with army cohesion when on land, which, you know, I mean, I don't really know if that's necessarily Viking, but it just forces you into that sea playstyle, which was how the Vikings tended to always move around. Naturally, as they were from Scandinavia, it was, you know, a lot easier to go. I mean, obviously the Vikings that did go on land, you know, you're looking at the Varangians that went down into the Kievan Rus, whereas the ones that became more raiding across the sea, that's the Vikings that are definitely more inspiring the Nords in Bannerlord. And, you know, you have the ships with the long ships, just that classic Viking look. Pair that with just the extreme focus on axes. Sturgia and the Nords have a very high focus on axes, which does work for both of them. And you do have, you know, the spears as well, very common Viking weapon. But, you know, I just think that the thing that's interesting with the Nords is that they aren't trying to, you know, blend multiple cultures together. Like I've already said, you know, the Sturgians blending that Slavic and part Norse with the Kievan Rus, and the Khuzaits are blending in many steppe nomadic cultures. The Nords, you know, they do occupy definitely a thinner portion of European history, which obviously is, I'm not saying Viking history is like small, but I'm saying that it's just quite a defined culture that they're trying to represent. They do also do shield walls very well, which is good. And, you know, I mean, they also like to speak about, they have the unit, the Sky Gods Chosen. That, I mean, there's not much religious, you know, words or phrases in Bannerlord, but the fact that they're mentioning the gods, obviously the Vikings were insanely obsessed about the gods and going to Valhalla, you know, and just being that warrior spirit. And you do also have a bit of a mercenary tradition as well, which I'm going to talk about a bit I'm going to do like a minor faction section, so I'm just going to cover that in one of the minor factions that really well represents the mercenary nature of the Vikings and how it ties in with the Nords. Moving on to geography, the map area that the Nords occupy basically does just look like Scandinavia, in my opinion. I mean, it's pretty much just looks exactly like Norway. And I was thinking that maybe the Baneland was kind of... I was thinking it could be Iceland, or it could just be the smaller islands in the North Sea. I don't know if it's quite... Iceland was a bit further away, but it could... I mean, it kind of looks a bit like Iceland, but it could be maybe, got Svalbard or the smaller islands off the coast of the British Isles. It could really be any of those. And also, I think it's important to note that the Nords only start with 4 towns. They do start with a lot of castles, but it is only 4 towns, which is even less than Battania. And I think that the thought process behind this low amount of towns is to force a Nord player into downward expansion and raiding, which just makes you follow that Viking lifestyle. They're not trying to sit back in their towns. They're going out and expanding, which I think is quite nicely represented through this low number of towns. So now I'm going to do a little section on some of the minor factions that link quite nicely into history. And we're going to start with the Legion of the Betrayed, because I think it's, if you know about Roman history and specifically the Manipular Legion, which was kind of from around the 4th to 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic did use this system of having 3 kind of lines, and this is represented with the Legion of the Trade, as they have the Hastati at the as the youngest troops, then the Principes, then the Triarii. I think that's just a nice detail to include, because whilst I think the majority of the empire acts as more the Byzantine Empire, the Legion of the Trade feels much more Roman Republic. Which kind of ties into the whole idea that they're betrayed and representing the old ways. Next, we have the Khuzait, who represents the steppe groups that refuse to join the steppe confederations of, say, the Mongols. These were groups like the Naiman, the Khuzait, and you also have the Oirat. And they just, in general, prefer to stay independent and follow a more nomadic lifestyle, and this is well represented within the Khuzait because it's pretty much just their lore to a T. They focus much more on mobility, with lighter armor kind of representing how they're poorer in nature, but they just refuse to assimilate and join in the big confederations and just choose to live that more nomadic lifestyle within the Khuzait lands. So now we're going to move on to the Skulderbrodder, who I think have one of the most tangible and interesting links to a real group from history out of any of the minor factions, and this was the Varangian Guard. Now, this was an elite unit of the Byzantine army from the 10th to the 14th centuries, and they served as personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors, and they were composed mainly of Norsemen from Scandinavia. And what's interesting is that these Norsemen travelled down from Scandinavia through the Kievan Rus and then headed down to the Byzantine Empire. And I think this is what's really trying to be represented here with the Skulderbrodder, is that mercenary aspect of the Vikings. I mean, they all use the two-handed axes, which are what the Varangian Guard were really known for. And they're just their ability to go around the map anywhere, sell their sword, and be fiercely loyal, as the Varangian Guard were. Because the Skulderbrodder, through the lore, you can see they're very focused on loyalty to each other, and, keeping a good reputation within their camps. I just think that the Skulderbrodder are a really, clear representation of the Varangian Guard, and they're a really interesting group to go look at. And finally, we have the Jawal, who are just built exactly like the nomadic Arab tribes of the medieval Middle East, the kind of Bedouin and desert-dwelling peoples that lived around the Arabian Peninsula. I talked about this a bit in my last video in part 1 when discussing the Aserai, but I think, that nomadic, instead of maybe a more caliphate focus like the Aserai are, I think you got to look more at that much more nomadic style when looking at the Joal, that focus on the light armor, the camel riding, the skirmish tactics with their javelins. And, you know, they just roam around the desert and are more loyal to each other and will sell their sword. But I just think they're a much better representation of the Arabic nomadic style than the rest of the Aserai are. Also, there are probably a few more minor factions I could talk about. This video is getting a little bit too long, so if you have any other minor factions you'd like to talk about, if you think there's any great historical links, just put them in the comments and I'll just reply to them and see, you know, if you've got any great takes, which I know many of you will. Okay, so that was part 2 of how Bannerlord factions were inspired by real historical groups. Let me know what you thought of the video, if you agree with my takes, if you disagree, if there's anything you think I missed, especially regarding the minor factions, please let me know in the comments. I'm always trying to improve. Make sure to like and subscribe and join the Discord server and comment any video ideas you'd like to see. Apart from that, that is it from me. Goodbye and thanks for watching.